Hey guys, tonight we begin with Quiet Secrets of Ancient Civilizations. Part 1. Whispers Beneath the Sand. Leisure in the Shadow of the Pyramids. Long before the stones of the pyramids had grown warm in the morning sun, the people of the Nile Valley had already begun their day. Smoke curled from cooking fires, bread dough rose in clay ovens, and laughter rang faintly from courtyards shaded with palm leaves. This was not the Egypt of triumphal processions or golden tombs. This was the quieter, humbler Egypt, one of hammocks strung between trees, sandals kicked off by garden pools, and moments of rest woven gently into the rhythm of life. The world saw their kings, their gods, their monuments, but behind that grand curtain, everyday people lived lives full of joy, creativity, and surprising peace. They were not constantly toiling under the desert sun. They played games, they threw feasts, they had jokes, hobbies, even pets that curled up beside them during lazy afternoons. And when the floodwaters came and turned their farmland into a sea of waiting, they found new ways to enjoy the pause. Take the game of Senate, for instance. It was carved into stone and wood, played on low tables, or even in the dirt. Though it held deep spiritual meaning, it was said to mirror the journey of the soul through the afterlife. It also brought friendly competition. Children played it for fun, adults played it for honor, and everyone played it to pass the long afternoons when the Nile ran high and the fields were too wet to work. Not far from the games, laughter echoed in courtyards where people gathered after long, dusty mornings. They ate dates and drank beer through long straws to avoid the barley husks floating on top. Some drank from painted ceramic mugs shaped like lions or hippos, their eyes wide and silly. There were dances, slow, hypnotic movements in tune with flutes and drums, and stories, told in quiet voices, of gods disguising themselves as animals, or fishermen tricking the crocodile with riddles. And then there were the gardens. These were hidden spaces behind wealthier homes, lined with sycamore trees and filled with birds. Pools of cool water shimmered in the shade, lilies drifting gently on the surface. In these gardens, time softened. Musicians plucked melodies on harps as couples sipped fermented date wine. It was not a grand performance. It was leisure, intimate, soft, and peaceful. Even rest had its traditions. During festivals, women wore fish-shaped charms in their hair, believed to bring fertility and good fortune. Children ran about with painted faces, chasing each other through alleyways and dusty plazas. Some tied feathers to their arms and pretended to be falcons racing the wind. Games made of pebbles, sticks, and imagination filled hours. No one wrote these down, but the joy lingered in the footprints left behind. And then, of course, there were the cats. Treasured not only for their skill in keeping mice away, but for their mysterious presence. Cats were more than animals. They were companions. They slept on cushions, rubbed against ankles, and were gently anointed with scented oils. Some were even buried with honor, wrapped in linen, and laid to rest with tiny amulets. At night, under a sky heavy with stars, families gathered on rooftops. Oil lamps flickered in the breeze as stories passed from lips to ears. Tales of clever gods, mischievous spirits, or real-life neighbors who once outwitted a royal scribe. It was in these moments, more than any carved decree, that a civilization passed itself forward. No scrolls were kept of how a boy once built a toy boat from palm bark, or how a grandmother shaped dolls out of river clay and named them all after stars. But those moments mattered. They built the soul of the people, the warmth that balanced the might of their rulers. While history chiseled the names of pharaohs into stone, the people lived their lives quietly, planting, weaving, laughing, resting. Their secrets were not locked in tombs, but carried on the wind, told in whispers between river reeds, left in chalk drawings on garden walls. Egypt's heart did not beat only in temples. It beat in shaded courtyards, in games played on quiet afternoons, in songs hummed beside the fire. And it is there, in those gentle, overlooked places, that the soul of the civilization still waits to be heard. Part 2. Beneath the Jungle Canopy. The everyday wonders of the Maya deep in the jungles where vines hung thick as curtains and the air shimmered with heat. The Maya built cities that seemed to grow out of the forest itself. Stone temples rose from green hills like mountains carved by human hands. But just beyond the great plazas and sacred courts, in the spaces history often overlooks, life bloomed in quieter, softer ways. Here, rest was not laziness, it was harmony. The Maya believed time moved in cycles, spirals, layers. Just as the earth needed rain and sun, people needed balance between duty and delight. There was time to plant maize, to honor ancestors, to study the stars, but also time to laugh, to dance, to play. Afternoons in the Maya world were often marked by the scent of roasting cacao. Not just a drink, it was a ritual. In village homes, women ground the beans with stone tools, adding chili or honey, depending on the occasion. Children waited eagerly as the warm, frothy drink was poured into painted cups. Elders sipped it slowly, savoring not just the flavor, but the moment. In courtyards shaded by broad banana leaves, games brought people together. The most famous was the ball game, pock to pock, played on massive stone courts. But in smaller spaces, people played simpler versions. Young boys practiced with rubber balls made from tree sap, bouncing them off walls, challenging each other with tricky moves. Winning wasn't everything. Style, spirit, and laughter often mattered more. Nearby, in the shade of huts made from palm and mud, artisans carved bone flutes or painted scenes on clay bowls. The designs told stories of gods, animals, and everyday mischief. One bowl might show a monkey stealing corn, another a rabbit dancing under the moon. These weren't for ceremony, they were for meals, laughter, and storytelling, art that lived with its people. Festivals were a constant rhythm in Maya life. Some honored gods of rain and maize, others marked celestial events. But many included music, feasting, and dancing. Masks were worn, not always solemn ones, but playful faces of jaguars, parrots, or frogs. Children joined in, spinning and stomping as drums beat like jungle thunder. Painted feet kicked up dust. Voices rang out in songs that told of creation, dreams, or simply the joy of being alive. In quieter moments, people found rest in hammocks tied between wooden posts, gently swaying with the breeze. These woven cradles were more than furniture. They were companions. People talked, napped, cradled babies, and watched stars emerge from their soft embrace. A hammock wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a window into the spirit of stillness. The Maya also had a deep connection to dreams. They believed sleep was a sacred state, where messages could be received from ancestors or gods. Some would keep small figurines near the resting places, hoping to influence dreams or remember them more clearly. In the morning, dreams were shared like gossip, some strange, some wise, all considered worth telling. Animals played their part too. Dogs roamed freely, seen not only as helpers, but as guides to the underworld. Turkeys strutted through courtyards. Macaws with feathers bright as fire squawked nonsense from the rooftops. Children gave them nicknames. Adults taught them words. Some birds were said to repeat gossip from the next village, and no one was quite sure if they were lying. When the day ended, fires were lit in clay braziers casting shadows on painted walls. Families gathered. Beans and tamales were shared. Someone always had a tale. A trickster rabbit, a talking jaguar, a man who turned into a bat to escape chores. The stars above were familiar, their patterns traced by grandmother's fingers. The same stars watched over everyone, from the priests in tall temples to the weavers in low huts. And as sleep came, the forest buzzed softly with its own lullaby. Crickets, frogs, the wind through leaves. The people rested not in silence, but in the comforting noise of a world that was fully alive. The Maya lived among mysteries of time, sky, and spirit, but their greatest secret may have been this. They understood how to live fully in both the sacred and the simple, how to weave joy into daily life like thread through cotton, how to rest, laugh, and dream without ever needing to carve it into stone. Part 3. Between Rivers and Stars. The Gentle Rhythms of Sumerian Life. Where the Tigris and Euphrates met and spread like fingers through the fertile earth, a quiet hum of life once echoed across the cities of Sumer. The ziggurats rose high above the plains, symbols of devotion and knowledge. But below them, in shaded courtyards and narrow alleys, the first cities of humankind breathed with a rhythm both simple and beautiful. Sumerian life was not just bricks and grain. It was lullabies, jokes, and slow afternoons by the water. These were people who measured the stars, charted the moon, and still had time to swing their legs from the edge of a reed boat and skip stones. After the sun reached its peak and clay buildings baked in the heat, work paused. Farmers sought shade beneath date palms. Children returned from lessons where they had practiced writing tiny wedge-shaped symbols in soft clay. They were still learning to read the world one tablet at a time. Now they ran barefoot, their giggles bouncing off the walls of the oldest cities known to man. In open spaces between houses, simple games came to life. Pebbles were tossed into circles drawn in dust. Clay spinning tops twirled on flat stones, and laughter followed their wobbly paths. One favorite pastime involved sticks arranged like mazes. The rules have vanished, but the joy remains, locked in drawings scratched on broken pottery. Rest wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. Small altars were kept in homes, and during calm afternoons, people lit oil lamps, offered bread or dates, and whispered thanks to local spirits. Some sang softly, not hymns of temples, but tunes about riverbirds, old tales, or even teasing verses about forgetful neighbors. Leisure often gathered around food. Dates, cheese, barley cakes, and beer formed the heart of many meals. But Sumerians didn't just eat, they dined. Meals were shared slowly, sometimes outside beneath woven awnings. One might bring a small drum, another a flute. Soon, rhythm filled the air, and someone would start clapping along with sticky fingers still dusted with flour. Cooks had their own kind of fun. Clay ovens gave birth to treats not recorded in royal records. Spiced lentils, honeyed flatbreads, and even roasted locusts were passed around with pride. Children would sneak bites before meals began, pretending not to hear their mother's scolding. Music was everywhere. In temples, yes, but also in streets and homes. Harps were small enough to cradle. Reed flutes could mimic bird song. It wasn't uncommon for neighbors to trade melodies like gifts. One might play a tune outside their doorway only for someone 2 streets over to echo it on a drum. No invitation was needed. Music welcomed everyone. There was another art, too, storytelling. Sumerians loved tales of gods and kings, but also of clever animals and foolish mortals. One favorite involved a donkey who tricked a lion by pretending to be an oracle. Another told of a fox who promised rain if someone gave him enough cakes he never delivered. When the moon rose, casting a silver path on the canals, families lay on rooftops. With warm breezes brushing over them and the scent of baked earth still lingering in the air, they watched stars emerge. The constellations, carefully named by scholars, became playgrounds for dreams. Children imagined the moon as a golden boat and Venus as a goddess with a sparkling dress. Cats wandered the rooftops, dogs curled near stairwells. The world slowed. Somewhere in the dark, someone hummed a tune older than writing. A lullaby carried not for performance, but for peace. They were the first city dwellers, the first stargazers, the first to build stories into symbols. But beneath those grand beginnings, Sumerians were also the first to enjoy an afternoon nap by a sun-warmed wall, or laugh at a joke told 100 times too many. Their names are faded, their walls now dust. But if you listen closely to the quiet wind between the reeds, you might still hear them. A mother calling her child in for dinner, the clap of sandals on brick, or the soft pluck of a harp in the golden hush of evening. Part 4. In the Shade of Olives, the Subtle Pleasures of Ancient Greece. Far from the marble temples and echoing speeches of the agora, there was another Greece, a quieter Greece, one where sun-dappled vineyards stretched across soft hills, and the greatest joys weren't carved into stone, but whispered between olive trees. This was not the Greece of gods and warriors, but of potters and shepherds, fisherfolk and philosophers in worn tunics. And while debates stirred in city squares, life in the towns and countryside flowed with a different rhythm, one of rest, play, and thoughtful ease. After the morning work, tending goats, hauling nets from the sea, shaping amphorae on the wheel, there came the pause, a kind of sacred slowness that the Greeks didn't just accept, but cherished. The word for it was skol, leisure. But it wasn't laziness. It was time to think, talk, be. Many gathered beneath fig trees or in the colonnades of shaded homes. They drank wine not to forget, but to slow down. Clay cups passed hand to hand, sometimes sweetened with honey, sometimes watered with cold spring flow. Nearby, figs and bread were shared without ceremony. A few olives, a cube of cheese, a joke that was older than the plates. Even games had a place here. Children played a game with pebbles called astragaloi, tossing and catching animal knuckle bones with quick fingers and sharp eyes. There were chasing games, too, and guessing games where players mimed animals until the rest burst into laughter. Adults, meanwhile, played strategy games on boards scratched into tabletops or carved into stone benches. Some played for fun, some for pride. A few claimed they could predict the outcome by the stars. By the coast, fishermen mended nets in rhythm with the sea breeze. They talked not only of tides and catch, but of dreams, old myths, or a song someone's grandmother used to sing. And when the sun dropped low, even the sea seemed to pause, holding its breath as boats bobbed in gold. In villages, festivals were small but warm. The larger cities might have grand processions. But here the joy came in dancing barefoot on packed earth, in singing a verse half remembered from childhood, in lighting a little lamp and offering it to the god of the hearth. Music filled the evenings, pipes and lyres, voices rising in harmony or drifting off key with cheerful abandon. There was time for solitude, too. A walk up a hill, a nap beneath a vine-covered trellis. Some took to scribbling poems in charcoal on clay, or painting little scenes on scraps of pottery. Lovers left messages under stones. Friends carved spirals into tree bark. These were not meant to last, but they lingered. Animals wandered freely. Cats basked on sun-warmed tiles. Chickens pecked at crumbs from the midday meal. Dogs curled beneath benches, dreaming whatever dogs have always dreamed. Even donkeys had their fans. One was said to dance whenever the lyre was played, though some said it just had itchy legs. And in the evening, after the sun dipped behind the hills and the scent of grilled herbs drifted from cooking fires, people returned to the central courtyards. The stars emerged, old companions, with names tied to gods and legends. But here, under their watch, the stories told weren't always heroic epics. Some were about misbehaving goats, others about a clever grandmother who once outwitted a whole wedding party with a fake snake and a jar of olives. That was the secret. Greece wasn't only built by the sword or the stylus. It was shaped by quiet dinners, games in dusty streets, and the comfort of familiar voices echoing under the same moon. The people understood something delicate, that the soul needed food just as much as the body, and that food could be laughter, music, rest, or simply silence shared in good company. So much of their wisdom is remembered in scrolls, in stone, in legend. But their most beautiful truths, those are found in the gentle hush of a shaded afternoon, when time slows, and the heart is full, and the world feels, if only for a moment, perfectly enough. Part 5. Whispers in the Sand. The Daily Joys of Ancient Persia. In the land where mountains met deserts and gardens bloomed like secrets in the dust, the ancient Persians lived with a quiet elegance. Their empires may have stretched for thousands of miles, and their kings may have sat on thrones of gold, but the true rhythm of Persia pulsed through courtyards, shaded terraces, and evenings wrapped in the scent of roses and smoke. Beneath the towering columns of Persepolis, and beyond the great royal roads, there was life filled with little rituals, small comforts treasured more than treasures themselves. Rest was not idleness, it was balance. Beauty wasn't reserved for palaces, it was woven into the everyday. A day often began with the hush of sunrise, soft light spilling across mud-brick homes, roosters calling from rooftops, and the smell of flatbread cooking on stone. Children woke to the rattle of pottery and the familiar voices of their elders. Before chores or lessons, there was time for stories. Short tales whispered from grandmothers as they plaited hair or ground grain. Persians loved gardens, not just to grow things, but to breathe. Walled enclosures of vines and fruit trees, trickling fountains and shaded paths, were places where people gathered to speak in verse and laughter. It was said that gardens were the earth's way of remembering paradise, and every home, rich or poor, tried to plant a piece of it. Rest here took many forms. In the hottest part of the day, cool halls with stone floors became sanctuaries. People lay on woven mats, sipped chilled drinks made from yogurt or rosewater, and let the world slow. Breeze blocks and clever architecture kept the rooms from sweltering. Voices dropped to whispers. Even the cats knew not to stir. There was time for games, too. Boys played board games that involved counting stones, betting on whose piece would reach the end first. Girls made patterns in dust and chased each other with ribbons. Adults played games with dice carved from bone or clay, each throw accompanied by hopeful glances to the sky. In the markets, between rows of cloth and spice, musicians appeared, flute players, hand drum masters, or singers with voices like worn silk. Some played for coin, others just for joy. A crowd could gather at any moment, and soon the clapping would begin, children dancing while adults pretended not to smile. Persians held poetry in high esteem, but not only in courts. Shepherds recited verses to the wind. Bakers sang rhyming chants to their dough. It was said that if one truly loved, they should be able to describe it in couplets. And so, even love letters, scribbled with crushed berry ink, were tiny works of art. Meals were shared in circles. There was rice fragrant with saffron, meats grilled over open flame, sweet dates, and sour yogurt. Every meal had its rhythm, a pause for thanks, a moment to share a joke, a respectful silence for those who had none. Children learned early that feeding another was a form of love. Evenings were a kind of magic. As the sun dipped behind the hills, rooftops became gathering places. Families climbed up with lanterns and blankets. Neighbors called out greetings from rooftop to rooftop. Tea brewed in small pots, thick with mint or cardamom. Someone would bring out a lute. Someone else would start a story about a sly fox, a proud rooster, or a lost prince who found happiness as a gardener. Laughter was not rare, nor were tears. Both were seen as signs of a heart still open. It was understood that emotions were like rivers. Better to let them flow than to dam them up. So people wept during stories, cheered at games, and embraced without hesitation. There was one old saying, often spoken at dusk: "The stars do not rush, and yet they shine." This was how the Persians lived, not hurried, not loud, but with grace stitched into their hours, and a quiet belief that peace was something one had to choose every single day. It's easy to remember the conquerors and kings, but this was the Persia that truly endured, in songs hummed beneath fig trees, in gardens tended at dawn, in the laughter that spilled across tiled courtyards under the calm gaze of the moon. Part 6. Beneath the jungle canopy, the secret lives of the ancient Maya, far from the towering pyramids and intricate calendars deep within the emerald maze of the rainforest. The Maya lived lives full of rhythm and wonder. They were astronomers and builders, scribes and sculptors, but also children who played in the mud, elders who chuckled over old tales, and farmers who hummed as they shaped the earth. Life in the lowlands moved to the pulse of nature. Days began not with clocks, but with birdsong and the soft rustle of leaves. Smoke from cooking fires rose in slow spirals through thatched rooftops, carrying the scent of corn and cacao into the misty morning air. And in those quiet dawns, a kind of magic lingered. Children played with toy animals carved from clay or followed beetles through the garden paths. Their games were half learning, half laughter, mimicking priests in mock ceremonies or pretending to hunt jaguars made of woven vines. In the villages, no one rushed childhood. Time, like the forest, was meant to unfold slowly. The Maya understood rest not as doing nothing, but as becoming still enough to listen. In hammocks slung between trees, people rocked gently, eyes closed, ears tuned to the cicadas. Rest came after labor, yes, but it also came between thoughts. A pause in the heat, a moment beneath the ceiba tree, watching the sky through branches believed to connect the worlds. Food was sacred, but meals were joyful. The day's rhythm followed the making of tortillas, corn soaked, ground, and pressed by hand with the same care passed down through generations. Mothers and grandmothers sang as they worked, old tunes in a language older than stone. The songs told of corn spirits, of rainfall, of mischief and love. And always there was laughter nearby. Children sneakily stealing bits of dough or trying to flip tortillas before they were ready. At dusk, markets blossomed like temporary cities. There, people traded not just goods, but gossip, riddles, and stories. A trader might offer a woven cloth along with a tale of how his parrot once insulted a priest. A potter might show off a bowl shaped like a monkey, saying it was inspired by the animal who stole her lunch 3 times in 1 week. Truth was flexible. What mattered was how well the story was told. Games were not rare, and the Maya had one in particular, Pak to Pak, a ritual ball game played with serious skill and a heavy rubber ball. But beyond the ceremonial courts, boys played their own versions with fruit or palm-wrapped balls, cheering and tumbling through the dust. Sometimes girls joined in, shouting louder than anyone. The rules changed with every game, and arguments were solved with laughter or a race to the nearest tree. Evenings were slow and golden. People gathered outside homes, seated on logs or woven mats. The air smelled of tamales and wood smoke. Elders spoke as the fire crackled, not to lecture, but to remember. They told of gods who shaped people from corn, of stars that walked the sky, of animals who once spoke and still might, if you listened closely enough. The jungle itself was part of the conversation. Its sounds, chirps, hoots, the far-off roar of a jaguar were never just background noise. They were voices in the nightly symphony. Children learned to recognize each one like family members. Owls meant it was bedtime. Frogs meant rain was near. Silence meant the forest was listening. Sometimes before sleep, people looked to the sky. The Maya watched the stars not only for ceremony, but for comfort. They saw stories written in constellations, reminders that everything was connected. The gods, the crops, the river, even the dreams that would come during the night. And when it was time to sleep, hammocks swayed under the weight of peaceful bodies and long days. The forest didn't stop. It whispered, it cradled, it watched over them. The Maya were great mathematicians and architects, but their truest genius may have been this, knowing that to live well was not just to count the stars, but to sit beneath them with your family, a warm drink in hand, and a story on your lips. Part 7. Smoke and Silence, the Gentle Rituals of Ancient China. Tucked between jade hills and winding rivers, where bamboo rustled and mist lingered in the valleys, ancient Chinese villages lived quietly beneath the shadow of dynasties. While history remembers the emperors and their great walls, beyond the palaces and scrolls were people who shaped their days with tea, tales, and time. Their world began with the kettle. Before tools were lifted or markets stirred, water was drawn, wood was lit, and tea leaves were placed with care into clay pots. The steam that rose was a kind of offering, not to gods, but to the day itself. Sips were taken slowly, in silence or soft conversation, as light slipped over tiled rooftops. In the countryside, fields stretched in neatly carved terraces. Farmers moved without haste, their rhythm set by the land. Work was steady, and so was rest. At midday, under paper umbrellas or beneath willow trees, hands were rinsed, mats were unrolled, and food appeared in lacquered boxes. Rice, pickled vegetables, a slice of salted fish, maybe something sweet wrapped in a leaf. There were no alarms, no loud commands. The cycle of the sun and the whisper of wind through trees were clocks enough. Children, when not helping in the rice paddies or feeding the ducks, played with sticks, stones, and imagination. One game involved spinning tops carved from bone or wood, racing them across smooth tiles. Another, more mischievous, had them mimic adults with exaggerated bows and overly polite phrases until someone burst into laughter. On cooler evenings, kites took to the air. They weren't just toys. They were messages to the sky. Made from paper, bamboo, and painted with dragons or phoenixes, they danced above rooftops. Some were fitted with strings that sang in the wind. Villagers watched from courtyards, heads tilted, sharing warm dumplings or roasted seeds from folded pouches. Craft was more than labor. It was expression. Elderly men carved miniature animals from soapstone not to sell, but to give to grandchildren. Women embroidered flowers into sleeves, not for wealth, but to honor the seasons. A simple clay bowl, shaped just right, was considered more beautiful than one gilded in gold. Music, when it came, was not loud. A plucked string here, a bamboo flute there. The sounds of nature, crickets, flowing water, the rustle of silk robes, blended into the melody. It was said that one could learn more from listening than speaking, and so silence was not awkward. It was respected. Rest wasn't a reward. It was a necessity, a kind of wisdom. People didn't push against exhaustion. They paused before it came. Afternoon naps were common, heads resting on folded arms or reclining on benches beneath plum trees. Even merchants closed shop during the hottest hours, trusting that the market, like the river, would still be there when they returned. Stories arrived like rain, sometimes gently, sometimes suddenly. An old woman might tell of a carp that turned into a dragon, or a boy who outsmarted a tiger using only a gourd. These tales were shared over firelight, the storyteller sipping tea, eyes gleaming as children leaned in, mouths slightly open. Evening slowed the world. Lanterns were lit one by one, their orange glow dancing along narrow streets. Shadows softened. Crickets began their chorus. Families gathered around low tables, chopsticks clicking like quiet percussion. And afterward, when the bowls were cleared, people often sat outside watching the moon, their voices low and easy. The moon was more than a light. It was a reminder that everything, from emperors to peasants, shared the same sky, that even if your roof was simple and your bowl plain, you could still find beauty in reflection, warmth in company, and peace in quiet. This was the rhythm of ancient China, not written in conquest or ruled by bronze, but found in the hush between harvests, in the sip between words, in the breath shared between dusk and sleep. Part 8. Footprints in the Dust. The everyday harmony of ancient Nubia. Along the slow-moving waters of the Nile, where the river curved through rocky hills and the sun painted the earth in gold and shadow, the people of ancient Nubia lived lives woven tightly with the land. Their temples and pyramids may still stand in silence today, but it was in their homes, gardens, and songs that the soul of their civilization truly whispered. Here, days began early, while the ground was still cool and the sky a soft gray blue. The sound of birds and the gentle splash of oars on the river announced the start of life. Small villages rose quietly with the sun. Smoke trailed from hearths, and the smell of baking flatbread mixed with the earthy scent of mud brick walls. Children fetched water with laughter and splashes. Pottery jars balanced expertly on heads, even as playful nudges sent ripples across the surface. Grandmothers watched from doorways, smiling without interrupting. After all, joy was just as important as chores. The river was a friend, not just a resource. People bathed in its banks, told stories beside it, and listened to its moods. Women washed clothes while trading news from one village to another. Fishermen returned with their catch, wrapped in reeds, exchanging good-natured boasts and teasing about who had the best bait. Rest here wasn't scheduled. It was sensed. When the sun climbed high and the shadows vanished, people slowed. Some retreated indoors, to cool rooms where walls were smoothed by hand and floors swept with care. Others found comfort in shade trees, dozing lightly or sipping from clay cups filled with fermented date drink or sweet tamarind water. Meals were shared, always. Dishes of stewed beans, grilled fish, and cracked grain were placed in the center. Everyone reached in, fingers pinching food with flatbread, voices blending into a hum of gratitude and gossip. Children were taught early to wait, to share, to offer before taking. These were not just rules, they were ways of honoring each other, and they danced, not for ceremony alone, but because the music lived inside them. A drumbeat could rise at any moment, and suddenly a circle would form, hands clapping, feet stamping, laughter rising like dust. Elders joined in with proud, deliberate steps. The young added leaps and turns no one judged. Dance was about feeling, not form. Clothing was simple, but never dull. Bright fabrics were dyed with earth and flower, and people often wore beaded necklaces or ankle bells. It was believed that beauty pleased the spirits, and so even ordinary days deserved a splash of color. At night, the desert sky stretched overhead like a vast, living ceiling. Stars blinked in patterns familiar and sacred. Some pointed out constellations said to be ancestors watching over them. Others simply lay back on woven mats and listened to the wind roll in from distant hills. Stories were the heartbeat of night. There were tales of crocodiles who whispered secrets, of sun spirits who hid in stones, of clever girls and talking goats. Each storyteller added their own twist. No one minded. The truth in these stories lived in the meaning, not the details. There was a saying often murmured as sleep crept in. The river remembers everything, and still it flows. It was a reminder to let go of troubles, to forgive gently, to keep moving forward like the water that shaped their world. In the quiet corners of Nubia, where trade and time passed without noise, people lived in harmony, not just with the land, but with each other. There were no towering monuments to ego, no endless rush, just warm hands, full bowls, and a rhythm that matched the earth itself. Part 9. Fireside Echoes. The gentle ways of the indigenous peoples of the Andes. High in the Andes, where clouds touched the mountains and llamas traced paths older than kings, people carved out lives with patience and care. These were not the cities of emperors and conquests, not yet. This was a time when the villages clung to the cliffs like moss, and the people listened more than they spoke. The day began with the breath of the wind. Before the sun peeked over the peaks, fires were already lit inside stone-walled homes, their warmth filling the cool, thin air. Families rose wrapped in wool, not with alarm or urgency, but with quiet purpose. A pinch of coca leaves, chewed slowly, helped wake the body and greet the mountain. Children were never far from animals, chasing young alpacas, mimicking the adults who led them with songs and clicks. Some helped carry bundles of grass, others sat beside their mothers spinning yarn with tiny fingers, more focused on the story being told than the thread itself. Everything had rhythm, even silence. Farming in the mountains was not loud or rushed. Terraces clung to hillsides like lines of poetry etched into stone. Tools were simple, but the wisdom behind them ran deep. Potatoes, maize, and quinoa were planted not just with hands, but with ceremony. Songs hummed into the soil, offerings left for the earth spirits, called apus, who watched from the mountain tops. Midday brought a pause. Workers knelt under the sky, sharing roasted corn and thick stews carried in gourd containers. Laughter echoed, not loudly, but enough to feel real. Rest was not laziness. It was knowing when to stop, when to feel the sun on your face, when to simply be, and they knew how to celebrate. Feasts didn't need a reason, only a good harvest, a birth, or a return from a long journey. Music came from flutes and drums, deep as thunder and light as birdsong. Dancers wore feathers and painted faces, moving like the rivers that cut through the valleys below. Even the old ones danced, hands raised, feet steady. Clothing was bright against the gray stone and green slope. Patterns weren't just decoration. They told stories of lineage, of seasons, of places walked. To wear something woven by your grandmother was to carry her blessing into the world. And then there were the games. Children tossed carved stones, played with spinning tops made of bone, or raced each other through narrow trails, barefoot and fearless. Adults, too, had games, strength tests, riddles, and sometimes silent contests, like who could balance a jug of water on their head the longest while walking the farthest. It was never about winning. It was about the joy in trying. Evenings belonged to the fire. As the stars arrived, everyone returned home. The smell of herbs, roasted tubers, and smoke filled the air. People sat in circles, bundled in blankets, eyes reflecting firelight. There were no scripts, no rehearsals, just the stories, passed down like heirlooms. One tale might be about the condor who stole the sun, another about a boy who climbed to the moon using only a flute, and always in the hush that followed, someone would add, and maybe it's still true. They believed in listening, to elders, to the wind, to animals, to the silence between things. This listening wove through everything. It taught them when to plant, when to rest, when to act, and when to trust. Before sleep, one last cup of warm drink was shared, often made from herbs gathered earlier that day. Children were tucked into thick wool blankets, and outside, the mountains stood watch like guardians made of sky and stone. Here, in the high places of the world, life wasn't loud. It was steady. It was sacred. It was stitched together with kindness, shared food, and stories strong enough to last for generations. Part 10. Between Sand and Sea. The Subtle Lives of the Berbers. Where the desert met the mountains and the wind carved whispers into the dunes, the Berbers lived quietly, moving like shadows across the sands of North Africa. Long before maps were drawn and borders laid, they knew the land not by names, but by the feeling beneath their feet, by the tilt of the stars, by the scent of the breeze. Life began with light. In the early morning, the sun painted the horizon with fire, and tents of woven goat hair slowly stirred. Fires crackled back to life, and the scent of flatbread baking under coals drifted into the crisp air. The first sounds were soft, sand shifting, pots clinking, low voices rising like prayer. Children ran barefoot, their laughter skipping across the stones. They climbed small dunes like mountains and slid down with arms wide. Games were simple, but full of joy. Tag played with shadows, races against the wind, and guessing games using pebbles hidden beneath cloth. The Berbers understood the value of movement, not rushing, but flowing. Camels were packed with care, not hurried. Saddlebags filled with dates, almonds, salt, and woven goods. When it was time to travel, it was a shared dance. Each person knew their step. The desert was not feared, only respected. It was not empty. It breathed. Rest came often and with meaning. In the hottest hours the caravan halted. Rugs were spread beneath rare trees or behind rocky outcrops, and water was shared from skin pouches passed hand to hand. Dates were eaten slowly. Silence was not discomfort. It was the desert's language. People listened to the wind like others might listen to music. Storytelling was everywhere, woven into carpets, etched into pottery, sung around evening fires. Each tale had a lesson, a laugh, or a mystery. Some spoke of desert spirits who danced with fireflies. Others told of travelers who followed a star too far and returned with a bird that sang in 10 languages. The people wore their history, clothes dyed with natural indigo, turbans wrapped in endless loops, jewelry made of silver and coral. A single bracelet might carry 5 generations of meaning. A tassel on a camel's harness might ward off envy. Even the patterns in a woman's scarf could speak her village's name to those who understood. Meals were modest but sacred. Tagines simmered with whatever was found, chickpeas, lamb, or wild herbs. Bread was torn and shared by hand. No one ate until everyone was served. The pot in the center was a promise. We are in this together. Even the stars were familiar. At night, the sky opened wider than the world. Families lay on their backs, naming constellations as if pointing out neighbors. The Milky Way was called the Camel's Path. The moon was a friend that never failed to return. Children listened wide-eyed as elders explained how the stars told time, marked seasons, and once saved an entire village from a lost journey. In towns along the trade routes, things were livelier. Markets buzzed with spices, music, and language blending into a rhythm only the locals could truly follow. Still, even amid the clamor, the Berber heart beat slow and steady. Traders would sip mint tea before a bargain, not to stall, but to connect. A good trade, they would say, starts with a good story. When illness came, healing was often gentle. Infusions brewed from desert plants, whispered blessings, and hands placed with intention. Elders knew which leaf soothed fever and which root calmed fear. They did not rush cures. They trusted the body's own rhythm like the land itself. And always before sleep there was music, a hand drum, a string plucked in the dark, a hum rising like smoke. People closed their eyes not just to rest, but to dream of journeys past and paths ahead. Dreams were not idle. They were guidance, a map in the mind. The Berbers did not build empires of stone. Their legacy was lighter, memory, movement, and meaning. Footsteps across sand that vanished by morning, but left something behind in the soul of the land. Part 11. Clay, wind, and water. The simple wisdom of the ancient Anatolians. In the cradle between mountain and plain, where Anatolia stretched under a vast changing sky, people lived among stone and soil in quiet harmony. Long before empires stamped their names into tablets, small communities scattered across what is now central Turkey shaped their days with the earth, fire, and a deep sense of rhythm. The village homes were low and round, built from sun-dried clay, their roofs flat and strong enough to sleep on during warm nights. Smoke spiraled gently from rooftop ovens at dawn, curling into the pale morning. The scent of baking barley bread was the unofficial call to begin the day. Children stirred first, always restless with curiosity. They played in dusty courtyards with toy animals made of clay, some lovingly shaped to look like goats or leopards. Stones became currency in imaginary markets. Lines scratched into the dirt became the borders of imagined worlds. Sometimes they'd simply chase chickens until the hens squawked and fluttered indignantly back to their roosts. Daily life unfolded without urgency. Farmers walked to their fields slowly with the same care one might give a story. Each step chosen, each action meaningful. Tools were wooden and worn smooth with use. Wheat, lentils, and emmer grew in careful rows, tended by hands that had shaped this land for generations. There were no overseers, no clocks, only the sun overhead and the call of birds to mark the hour. Midday heat brought a pause. Work was set aside for shared meals under woven awnings. Bread, olives, yogurt, and roasted grains filled clay bowls. Meals were eaten with fingers, and everyone, even guests, were served with the same quiet generosity. Food was more than sustenance. It was a ritual of togetherness. Art was everywhere, but never loud. Patterns were etched into pots, painted onto walls, woven into mats. Spirals, deer, eyes, trees, symbols whose meanings weren't always spoken, but always felt. Potters sang as they worked, their hands shaping vessels as their ancestors had, spinning stories into clay with every turn of the wheel. Women painted their faces with ochre, not for vanity, but for protection, celebration, and sometimes mourning. Jewelry was made from bone, shells, and beads. Each piece held a memory. A girl's necklace might include her grandmother's bead, passed down with a soft blessing, whispered at dusk. Evenings brought the village together again. Around small fires, people sat on mats, sharing not just food, but tales. There were stories of animals who could speak, of stones that wept, of stars that once walked the earth in human form. These weren't just entertainment. They were the fabric of meaning, stitching lessons into memory. There were games, too, not grand, but joyful. Simple contests of balance or speed. How far one could leap. How long one could balance a stick on the back of their hand. Laughter came easily, but no one teased to wound. The goal was not to win, but to share the moment. Music was made from flutes carved from bone and drums stretched with hide. The songs were slow, repetitive, meant to lull rather than excite. Dancers moved in circles, hands joined, steps steady like the turning of the seasons. It was said that the earth liked this rhythm, that it made the crops grow better when people danced. Water was sacred. Springs were visited with quiet respect. Offerings of flowers or polished stones were left beside pools that reflected the sky. It was believed that spirits lived in water, in trees, in the winds that swept over the plains. People did not fear them. They spoke to them, sang to them, lived alongside them. Illness was met with herbs, chants, and warm hands. Elders carried knowledge like seeds in a pouch, ready to be planted when the time came. Remedies were whispered, not written. Healing was not just physical, it was also the return of balance between person and place. At night, families gathered on rooftops or near fires. The stars above Anatolia stretched endlessly, and the people watched in silence, sometimes pointing out familiar constellations, other times simply listening to the wind. Dreams were shared in the morning like weather reports, treated with respect, decoded slowly, treasured like secret maps. The Anatolians didn't build palaces, but they built community. Their walls may have crumbled, their names faded, But the way they lived close to the land, to each other, to the small mysteries of life, still hums beneath the earth. Part 12. The Last Light of Dusk. The Unspoken Wisdom of the Ancient Minoans. On the island, where the sea shimmered like polished glass and hills rolled into the sky like sleeping animals, the Minoans built lives shaped by tides and time. Long before legends of labyrinths and monsters, there were simple joys, painted walls, and a world gently in motion. Life on Crete was tied to the sea, not just for trade or travel, but as a way of understanding the world. The sound of waves was like a lullaby, ever present. Boats bobbed in the harbors, not massive warships, but elegant curved vessels that looked as if they were carved by the sea itself. Children learned to swim before they could write, diving for shells, splashing under the sun, shouting in voices carried away by wind. Homes were painted with color, not just for decoration, but for life. Blue, red, ochre, scenes of dolphins, birds, lilies, and people dancing covered the walls. Even the ceilings sometimes had stars painted on them, so no one ever forgot the sky, even at night. The air inside was cool and fragrant, filtered through open courtyards where pots of herbs grew and lizards scurried. Mornings began with brightness. Bread baked in clay ovens filled alleys with warmth. Figs and honey were set out on small tables. Olives were pressed with practiced rhythm, and fish, wrapped in leaves, roasted over hot stones. The market stirred like a song, baskets of saffron, bronze trinkets, pottery, and laughter echoing beneath archways. Children weren't kept away from work. They learned by watching, by touching, by being close. They helped spin wool, grind grain, feed goats, and in quiet moments they painted beside their elders, fingers dipped in natural dyes. There was no rush to grow up, only time stretched like golden thread from one generation to the next. Women held space. They weren't hidden or hushed. They ran households, led ceremonies, and stood tall in frescoes with flounced skirts and bare shoulders. In the open air, they danced, movements like waves, sometimes with bells at their ankles or ribbons streaming from their wrists. These dances weren't just for festivals. They were thanks, remembrance, and hope made visible. Even play held purpose. Games were physical, leaping over bulls and feats of daring or playing catch with knotted cords. Others were more quiet, puzzles of carved wood, or games with stones placed in circles. Young ones practiced balance, not just with their bodies, but in how they shared, how they listened. Ceremony was gentle. In cool caves or atop mountain shrines, offerings of grain, flowers, or tiny sculptures were left for unseen spirits. No idols loomed, no punishments were shouted. Instead, the sacred was found in the rustle of olive trees, the curve of a shell, the hush before dawn. Music wove through daily life, reeds, lyres, and the beat of hands on stretched hide, not for concert halls or conquest, but to accompany weaving, walking, resting. Some evenings neighbors would gather, a fire flickering between them, and a single voice would rise in song, joined gradually by others. The melodies weren't always planned. They followed feeling. When someone passed on, there was mourning, but not despair. The dead were buried with favorite tools, small vessels, and flowers. Their names were spoken softly for many seasons. It was said the spirits liked to linger near hearths, sipping the steam of tea, watching the children grow. Trade brought visitors, Phoenicians, Egyptians, travelers from distant coasts, but the heart of the island beat at its own pace. Foreign bronze and strange spices arrived, But the stories told in Minoan homes remained grounded in waves and wild goats, in stories of dancing moons and talking fish. There were no towering armies, no sprawling conquests, no need for fortresses. Their walls weren't built high because they lived in openness, trusting that those who arrived would be greeted, not feared. At night, lanterns flickered behind latticed windows. The wind, salty and warm, wandered through alleyways. People slept on rooftops beneath stars or in cool rooms scented with herbs. Dreams drifted in like tides, soft, slow, full of meaning. And in those dreams, the Minoans listened to the world, not to rule it, but to live in rhythm with it. Their stories didn't need to be shouted. They were whispered in colors, in dances, in the silence between waves. They understood something deep, that the greatest civilizations weren't always the loudest, but the ones that knew how to live fully and leave traces not just in stone, but in spirit.